Welcome everybody. My name is Salman Amar. I'm the Vice President for Research at New York Medical College, and he give me a tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this webinar entitled Conflict Principle to be Learned from Healthcare Compliance, Investigation and Enforcement. Just a couple of housekeeping information. The seminar has been approved for continuing education, and you'll see a slide coming up. Here we go. You can, I would advise you to take a picture of this slide and enter the information as needed. The seminar is open for questions. We will take the questions at the end of the seminar, so not to disturb the speaker, and we'll address all the questions at once at the end of the seminar. So don't hesitate in the chat box or Q&A to post your questions. It gives me a tremendous pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, John Rah. John Rah received his education, Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University, as well as a BA from New York University. He's a partner at DLA Piper, a global law firm, and he advises pharmaceutical medical device manufacturers and healthcare organizations on corporate compliance program development to mitigate risk of fraud and abuse. He has counseled several clients on investigation with inquiries from the Department of Justice, the Office of the Inspector General, and his work also includes conducting internal investigation for healthcare companies. He has multiple prominent healthcare companies as clients. He has a deep background in negotiating and implementing corporate integrity agreement and consent decrees, as well as regulatory interacts with the Office of the Inspector General and other relevant agency in connection with the integrity agreement. He's prolific in his writing. Title of his presentation is timely, given all the compliance that we have in the academic as well as with the industry to comply with. The title of his presentation is Conflict Principle to be Learned from Healthcare Compliance, Investigation and Enforcement. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming John Rah. John,
thank you.
All yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Amar, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Just to expand a little bit on what Dr. Amar mentioned, I'm with DLA Piper. We're a global law firm, have over 4,000 lawyers in 90 plus offices in 40 plus countries, obviously all throughout the world. And I'm part of sort of a larger life sciences healthcare practice here at the firm, where we advise on all aspects of healthcare law, healthcare compliance for all players in the industry. I happen to focus on pharmaceutical manufacturers, but we represent hospitals and academic medical centers and all sorts of providers and suppliers. And like Dr. Amar, you mentioned, I really want to sort of go through sort of what my practice is, and not so much to talk specifically about the law, but how the area of compliance and healthcare fraud and abuse and the healthcare laws really inform all decision-making throughout healthcare, not just in the pharmaceutical manufacturer side, which is my area of expertise, but all manner of decision-making and arrangements that entities have or individuals have among one another on the healthcare space. So I'm not going to talk specifically about conflict of interest policies per se, but obviously, every organization has conflict of interest policies, particularly in the healthcare space. Obviously, New York Medical College has their own conflicts and ethics rules. ACCME on medical education has ethics rules on managing conflicts of interest, the AMA and the NIH. And the purpose really of all of these conflict rules is to avoid situations where an individual or organization has some interest, whether financial or otherwise, that could be at odds with other interests or obligations of the individual or organization. So here I just pulled this. This is a little bit of an old article, but this is a Washington Post article from December 20, 2006, focusing on this congressional inquiry of a conflict of interest involving a government scientist who was involved in medical research and who admitted in federal court that he failed to improperly disclose payments of $280,000 or $85,000 he received as a consultant for the pharmaceutical manufacturer. He admitted to entering into consulting arrangements with the pharmaceutical manufacturer going back to 1998 without receiving the required approval in advance or disclosing his income after the fact. He was paid as a consultant on 2 projects in which his department was collaborating with the manufacturer on research to identify chemical warning signs of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I will say, like the government, the fact that there was a consulting arrangement in and of itself isn't per se improper, but these conflict rules and these transparency rules and disclosure rules are designed to address, perceptions of improper behavior or decision making as a result of these arrangements that could create at least perception issues. So I want to go through really quickly. I'm sure you guys are all aware, but in the healthcare space, the reason why it's so highly regulated is because so much healthcare is provided through some federal healthcare program. When you look at these fraud and abuse laws, by and large, they regulate conduct to any entity or individual who receives any reimbursement directly or indirectly from a federal healthcare program. And these are broadly defined as these programs: Medicare, people 65 or older; Medicaid for lower income adults and children. You have SCHIP, which is the State Children's Health Insurance Program; TRICARE for active duty military; Veterans Health Administration for retired military; and then the Indian Health Service for federal health services to American Indians and Alaska Natives. So if you look at this report here, national healthcare spending is expected to reach $3.81 trillion in 2019, and will increase to $4.01 trillion in 2020. So CMS, which is the agency that's responsible for administering these federal programs, projected by that 2028 healthcare spending would reach $6.19 trillion and would account for 19.7% of the GDP, up from 17.7% in 2018. So I provide these numbers to show you how much of healthcare in this country is paid for or covered by some form of federal healthcare programs, and why the government has such a keen interest in making sure that players in this space act appropriately and comply with the myriad of fraud and abuse laws that govern all of our conduct in this space. So these are some of the key fraud and abuse laws that really govern arrangements and activity in the healthcare space. So the first one is the anti-kickback statute, and essentially it makes it illegal to offer or accept a bribe to induce the referral or providing an item or service that the government pays for. So in other words, if I were to provide, something of value to a doctor to induce that person to prescribe my product from a pharmaceutical manufacturer perspective, that would violate the kickback statute, and that would be a criminal violation of the statute. And you can go to jail for that and pay criminal penalties for that. Both the manufacturer could be criminally liable, as well as the doctor receiving the bribe. You have the Stark law, which is the physician self-referral law, which basically prohibits referring patients to receive designated health services from any entity in which the physician or an immediate family member has a financial relationship. So those health services could be clinical lab services, physical therapy, occupational therapy, DME supplies. There's a whole list in the Stark law of what those services would be that are prohibited from the Stark law. Exclusion is an interesting remedy. That's actually a remedy by the government that if an individual or an entity violates some law or does some other activity, the government either has to exclude you for certain things, like a criminal conviction, felony conviction of the kickback statute. The government has to exclude you from participating in the federal healthcare programs, which means that any item or service that you provide, the government will not pay for. And again, given how much of healthcare is paid for in this country by the federal healthcare programs, that effectively means that individual providers and suppliers and entities, if they get excluded, they're essentially out of business because so much of their business relies on coverage and reimbursement by these programs. The False Claims Act is sort of one of the key laws that the government uses to enforce these laws. So the False Claims Act essentially says you cannot submit a false claim or cause someone to submit a false claim to the government. And the interesting thing about this law is that this law, it allows private citizens known as relators or qui tam relators to bring a lawsuit on behalf of the government, whistleblowers, who can allege that any company or individual submitted a false claim to the government. And this has been the primary enforcement vehicle by the government over the past 20 years in enforcing healthcare fraud and abuse in this country. And then you have the Physician Payment Sunshine Law, which is not necessarily a fraud and abuse law, but again, it's designed to address sort of transparency in financial arrangements by pharmaceutical manufacturers and medical device manufacturers and U.S. physicians and other healthcare professionals, where the manufacturers have to report to the government every transfer of value that they provide to a physician, whether it's a consulting honoraria or whether it's a bagel provided during an in-office promotional detail. So what are the goals of these laws? Very similar to the conflict rules. First and foremost, avoid patient harm. Secondly, prohibit corruption of medical decision-making. The government wants to make sure that when they're paying for a healthcare item or service, that decision to prescribe that item, provide that service, was made because it was in the best interest of the patient and not corrupted by any other outside influence, like a bribe or improper kickback. The government also wants to make sure that healthcare items and services aren't overutilized. Even if it might be appropriate for the patient, they don't want to pay for things that may not necessarily be necessary for the patient or to be used. Patient steering. They don't want improper influences to steer patients to particular entities or individuals to get healthcare services. They want to make sure that if a patient's going somewhere, it's because of patient freedom of choice and based upon principled reasons, maybe provided by the healthcare professional or everybody else, but they don't want anyone interfering with that decision making by the patient or the HCP. Unfair competition, they're entities. They don't want to have individuals or entities having a leg up because they're engaging in bribes or other improper steering or other improper activity. Levels the playing field. And then avoid improper claims to payers in federal and state programs. So when you think about these goals of healthcare laws, and that's what I do when I provide advice to companies, is, obviously you have to know the elements of the law, but for you, the key elements of the law aren't, I don't think, as critical necessarily. I mean, you get your training on this as with respect to your certain institutions, but you always want to remember what the goals of these laws are to inform decision making every step of the way. So the scope of these fraud and abuse laws, they apply to everybody. They apply to providers and suppliers, individual healthcare professionals, MDs, DOs, NPs, as well as healthcare entities, hospitals, nursing homes, home health agencies, DME suppliers, as well as other players in this space. So pharmacies, PBMs, pharmaceutical benefit managers, managed care entities, and pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers. And they have even applied to sort of other entities that you wouldn't necessarily think are direct providers or suppliers or manufacturers. We've seen the government go after big consulting firms like McKinsey because they provided advice to their clients that caused that company to engage in improper activity that violated these laws. And the government has gone after McKinsey and entered into settlements reaching the hundreds of millions of dollars. They've entered into settlements with clinical decision software makers and their interactions with manufacturers on how that the CDS software caused improper decision making by these healthcare professionals, which caused the government to pay for items and services that the government didn't feel were appropriate because the CDS software influenced that HCP improperly. So these laws are wide ranging and they can apply to almost anybody who touches the space. Just really quickly, I mean, when you deal with healthcare fraud and abuse in the healthcare space, you're just dealing with the alphabet soup of agencies, right? You have Food Drug Administration, which basically approves products, prescription products to be used in this country. You have the Office of Inspector General, Health and Human Services. That agency is actually responsible for protecting the integrity of all the federal healthcare programs, meaning that they want to make sure that there's no fraud and abuse committed on those programs. So they will issue guidance to the industry about, how you set up compliance programs or key risk areas for various sectors of the healthcare industry. And that's the agency that actually has the authority I talked earlier about exclusion. This is the agency that, based upon certain factors, they can seek to exclude you as an individual or as an entity from participating in the federal healthcare programs. The Department of Justice is the arm of the government that actually enforces these laws. They prosecute these laws, either civil or criminal laws. So violations of the False Claims Act or the kickback statute, for criminal violations or civil violations, that will be the Department of Justice that investigates that and prosecutes. And then CMS is the agency that oversees and administers the federal healthcare programs. And they issue guidance and coverage guidance and things like that, so that help the healthcare professionals and entities to understand what's covered, what's not, and provide various guidelines on billing and coding, etc. So you have not only the federal government involved, but you have states have their individual laws, and being sensitive. And a lot of times these state laws mirror the federal government's requirements. But states also reimburse for healthcare in this country, and primarily through Medicaid, which is a joint federal and state program that provides healthcare for the financially needy. And they have their own laws, consumer protection laws. They have their own state false claims acts. They have their own state kickback laws. So violating the federal laws could also mean that you're violating the state laws as well. And really quickly, just wrapping up on the False Claims Act and DOJ, like I said earlier, this has been the primary vehicle through which the government has enforced healthcare fraud in this country. And if you look at every year since 1986, which is when the False Claims Act added that provision to allow private citizens to bring lawsuits on behalf of the government. This law was originally called the Lincoln Law, and it was enacted during the Civil War to sort of prevent or to go after people who were submitting all these false claims to the government for supplies provided during the Civil War. But in 1986 is when they added the provision to allow private citizens to actually bring a lawsuit in the name of the government, which has really opened this up, because now anybody can bring one of these lawsuits under the False Claims Act. And since 1986, they've tracked the statistics of how much they've recovered. So in 2019, they recovered a total of $3.05 billion under the False Claims Act. $2.6 billion related to healthcare. So when you think about all the ways that false claims can be submitted to the government, government contractors charging $1 million for a screwdriver, defense contractors, all of those activities and all of those entities are subject to the False Claims Act. Healthcare is by and large the largest chunk of recoveries under the False Claims Act. So in 2019, it was $2.6 billion out of $3.05 billion. And in 2020, it was $1.8 billion out of $2.2 billion. And you'll see when DOJ issues these statistics, they note here kickbacks in the healthcare industry are pernicious because of their potentially to subvert medical decision making. And that DOJ also has resolved matters which providers billed federal healthcare programs for medically unnecessary services are not rendered as billed. So again, we go back to the principles and the goals of these laws. Don't corrupt medical decision making. Don't cause anything to result in overutilization of medical services. And what DOJ is saying here is that, yes, we are going after that, and that is pernicious in this space, and we're going to use the False Claims Act as a way to make sure that we enforce these laws. Just really quickly, I wanted to just show a few examples of settlements, particularly ones involving individual healthcare professionals, because I think a lot of times in the news you'll hear about a big manufacturer entering into a settlement for $2.33 billion. And these settlements can get very big when you're talking about pharmaceutical manufacturers and large entities. But the government has really started to make a concerted effort over the past several years to also go after individuals, not only individuals within the company. So a company might settle a matter, but nobody in the company gets prosecuted or enters into settlements. So they want to go after individuals, not only the companies, but they also want to go to other individuals involved in these, what the government believes are improper financial arrangements or improper schemes. So for example, in March 2021, you had this Oakland cardiologist named Dr. Dinesh Shah. He and his practice, Michigan Physicians Group, paid $2 million to resolve allegations that they violated the False Claims Act by billing federal healthcare programs for diagnostic testing that was neither unnecessary or not performed. So straightforward, in the government's mind, false claim. You just billed us for stuff that you didn't do or wasn't necessary. March 2021, again, Dr. Truk Lee, osteopathic medicine from Bel Air. resolved allegations. He falsely certified patients for home health services and then received improper payments. So essentially, the home health agency was paying him a kickback to refer patients to that agency. And he did so without any knowledge of the patient's medical condition or homebound status. So according to the Department of Justice, medical professionals put the integrity of our federal healthcare programs at risk when they just rubber stamp forms. And it's made worse when improper payments are the source of their motivation. So again, we see the government sort of trying to enforce the goals of these laws is freedom of choice, corruption of medical decision-making, overutilization of services. Now, I will say when you look at these allegations and these settlements, oftentimes the way they're described is described through the DOJ's lens. And so they're going to try to describe these things in the most pernicious and evil ways possible. Having worked with a number of entities who've been investigated by the government or looked at by the government, the facts aren't always as clear-cut. So you could have had a situation here in this Dr. Truckley. I don't know if this is the case, but for example, he may have had an arrangement with a home health agency to provide consulting services. And maybe the government felt like it wasn't consistent with fair market value and what you would normally pay for that consulting service. So the fact that you paid him more must suggest something improper. And maybe there were a few other facts and circumstances where the government thought, you got paid more. And then there was some discussion about how the doctor would try to make sure patients go to this home health agency, whatever it is. When the government makes these cases, it's not generally that there's a smoking gun that says, I will give you this and you will give me that. It's always based upon a different facts and circumstances. There was a payment that exceeded fair market value, and there was an email that suggested potentially improper intent. You typically don't have that smoking gun. So they build up the case to show intent by pulling all these various facts and circumstances to make their case. And that's why when we talk about healthcare compliance, particularly what I do on the pharma side, is that there's a lot of things that we do to try to mitigate that perception risk or mitigate, those different facts and circumstances from being used in the future for some possible enforcement action when that doesn't really evidence what the true intent was of the arrangement. Just another one, March 2021, Feng Quinn practiced in Lower Manhattan and in Queens. He was criminally charged in December 2018 with fraudulently billing Medicare for vascular surgery procedures performed on ESRD patients that were not medically reasonable or necessary or covered under Medicare rules. So he and his practice agreed to pay $783,000. For this particular example, this individual doctor actually was excluded by the government, again, which prohibited him from participating in any federal healthcare programs for 4 years. And so that was the False Claims Act. You also have a number of individuals who've actually been criminally prosecuted by the Department of Justice. And a lot of these are from INSYS. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the INSYS case, but INSYS is a pharmaceutical manufacturer, a manufacturer of opioids, and particularly fentanyl spray. And the government went after INSYS for improperly promoting fentanyl spray for off-label uses, for downplaying the safety of its products, and for also engaging in kickbacks with a bunch of doctors to speak on behalf of the company. But the government said that those were really kickbacks because those payments were really designed to have high prescribers just prescribe more of their product, and they weren't really for bona fide legitimate speaking programs. And so as part of the investigation and prosecution of the company, the government also investigated a number of these healthcare professionals with whom INSYS had entered into these speaking or other consulting arrangements. So here's a few, and we're not talking about sort of Dr. Feelgood's pill mill in some small town. These are healthcare professionals at prominent institutions throughout the country. So we have this Gavin Auerbach, Michigan pain doctor. He was sentenced to 32 months in prison. I'm just going to skip down really quickly. You have a physician from New York Medical, Mount Sinai. You have physicians affiliated with NYU Medical Center, Mount Sinai. And these physicians, a number of them got sentenced to prison. 51 months you see for Gerald Rosenberg, 48 months for Christopher Clow, Alexander Bertishow, 57 months in prison. These other ones here, at the time that I drafted these slides, which was a year ago, they were awaiting their sentences. But these folks were also all convicted of violations of the kickback statute, meaning They were convicted and found guilty of accepting bribes from INSIS and were awaiting sentencing. So one of the things that the government really wants healthcare providers and entities to do, because of all of these laws and because of all of these activities that can implicate or violate one of these laws, they really want to make sure that companies and individuals understand the purpose of compliance programs and to develop compliance programs for their particular organization. And just by way of brief background, the compliance programs really consist of 7 elements, and they come from what's called the federal sentencing guidelines. And these guidelines are used by federal courts when they sentence individuals and entities. And so the guidelines provide different factors for increasing a penalty and different factors for decreasing the penalty. One of the factors for decreasing the penalty is the existence of an effective compliance program. And in the guidelines, they talk about what the 7 elements are of an effective compliance program. And that has essentially been now sort of what everyone talks about with respect to a compliance program. So what they are implementing policies and procedures and standards of conduct, designated people in charge of compliance within the organization, like a compliance officer and compliance committees, conducting education and training, effective lines of communication, meaning, there are ways for people to raise concerns internally within the company, anonymously if they want, and without fear of retribution or retaliation. Monitoring and auditing. Look at key risk areas applicable to your organization. If it's coding or billing or medical records or whatever, or financial arrangements, audit and monitor a sample of those transactions or those activities to see, hey, did they comply with our policies? Enforce standards through well-publicized disciplinary guidelines, meaning when there are violations of policy, people understand what the ramifications are, including potential termination from the organization. And people should be aware of what those guidelines are. And then finally, if a company learns of potential wrongdoing, that they respond quickly. They investigate it, they look at what caused it, look for root causes, and implement corrective action. So if you look at these 7 elements, 2 quick key takeaways from it. Compliance programs are really designed to do 1 or 2 things. One is to prevent bad stuff from happening in the first place, right? That's why we have policies. That's why we train. That's why we have a compliance officer committee. So part of it is to prevent something from happening in the first instance. But the government understands fully that nobody is perfect. No organization is perfect, and that things will go wrong. And just because things go wrong doesn't mean it's necessarily a violation of law. But they want to make sure that the compliance programs are also not only designed to prevent something from happening, but that they also try to detect things that are happening. And that's why you have things like monitoring and auditing, responding to issues that are raised throughout the organization. It's partly shake the trees, go find it if you find something, shake the trees to see if there's anything there, or have mechanisms in place for people to report to you in a way that they feel comfortable doing so, and then respond to those concerns that are raised. So it's all about prevention and detection. And those are the 7 elements. So the OIG, again, which is the agency responsible for protecting the integrity of the federal healthcare programs, over the past 20 plus years, they've come out with a bunch of different guidances, and some of them tailored to specific players in the healthcare industries. For example, they have guidance for pharmaceutical manufacturers or nursing homes and hospital, individual physician practices. And they talk about the importance of creation of a compliance program, and they go through what they think are some of the risk areas associated with those different entities in the healthcare space. This is also OIG Guidance, a roadmap for new physicians. And what they do acknowledge here is that everyone, by and large, is trying to do the right thing, right? Most physicians strive to work ethically, render high quality medical care to their patients, and submit proper claims for payment. And that the government places enormous trust in physicians. And so they talk about the federal healthcare programs and how these programs are relying on the physician's medical judgment to treat beneficiaries with appropriate services. Again, it goes back to all those goals of what the fraud and abuse laws are designed to prevent. And so this guidance here really goes through different types of activities or things to look out for as a healthcare professional who's treating patients and who receives reimbursement from federal healthcare programs. They include relationships with your payers, or relationships with fellow physicians and other providers, and relationships with vendors. And they'll also get into relationships with pharmaceutical manufacturers and other entities in the healthcare space. This is a similar, CMS has also issued some guidance: Medicare fraud and abuse, prevent, detect, and report. And again, acknowledging that physicians are trying to work ethically, provide high quality medical care. And again, reiterating the trust that the government is putting into physicians and everyone in the healthcare space to make sure that everyone is acting in a way to advance all of those goals of the healthcare fraud and abuse laws. In my work, doing work for pharmaceutical manufacturers on the compliance program side, I tend to really believe that everyone is really trying to do the right thing. And that sometimes you have bad apples. You're going to have that in any organization. But by and large, what we try to do is make sure that people understand what they're supposed to do and engage in their activities in a compliant way. But people have their own pressures. People aren't necessarily motivated by improper intent or improper goals. But you really have to look at sort of the pressures put on these people, the quotas or the metrics that people are measured on, and not only understand that that people aren't necessarily bad, but people are going to act in their self-interest to some extent. So when we talk about compliance and doing the right thing, it's not that we're necessarily solving for evil people out there who want to pay kickbacks or do bad things. We've also got to solve for what the dynamic is in the organization. What is potentially creating improper pressure on a person to act improperly? And not necessarily because they're bad, but because that's just the way the environment is, the incentive structures are set up in the organization, or whatever. So compliance really is about thinking about how do good people potentially do bad things because they don't quite understand the rules, it's overly complicated, or there's incentives that exist in the organization that are not necessarily consistent with acting in appropriate and ethical ways. More on the CMS guidance, again, to healthcare professionals, reinforcing the role that healthcare professionals play in the integrity of the program. And like the OIG guidance, it goes into various risk activities and arrangements that can create risk with respect to activity. And then CMS also, like I was talking about with compliance programs, talk about the importance of establishing compliance programs to, again, prevent and detect improper behavior. And compliance programs can be expensive, and I think the government has always acknowledged that a compliance program doesn't have to be one size fits all, and in fact should not be one size fits all. Rather, organizations should always assess for themselves what is appropriate for them and right size a compliance program for themselves. And if it's not necessarily all of these elements, or if you're blending some of these elements, think about what each of these elements is designed to achieve, and for your organization, what you think the best way is to roll out a compliance program. So in this CMS guidance, they also talk about conflict of interest disclosures. And they talk about how the fact that the fraud and abuse laws govern a lot of conduct and, quite frankly, a lot of the relationships that different players have in the healthcare industry. So what they say is many of the relationships discussed in this booklet are also subject to conflict of interest disclosure policies. So even if the relationships are legal, you may be obligated to disclose their existence. Rules about disclosing and managing conflicts of interest come from a variety of sources, including grant funders, NIH, FDA, when you submit data to support marketing approval of new drugs. So I think what CMS is saying here is that not only do we have these fraud and abuse laws, which regulate and govern how we interact with one another or what types of arrangements we enter into, but just be sensitive also to the conflict of interest disclosures. Because another goal, I think, of both the fraud and abuse laws, at least from a compliance perspective, and these conflict of interest disclosures, is not just not violating the law or not making sure that we take we make decisions in the best interest of the patient, but it's also reputational. I mean, companies care and individuals care about their reputation. And even if something's not illegal, even if something may not technically violate a conflict of interest disclosure requirement, there are reputational risks too with entering into some of these arrangements or some of these activities. So we should always be sensitive about how these things could potentially be misperceived by outside individuals or entities. And that was really what I want to go through in terms of the written materials, and really want to give an opportunity for people to raise questions or comments.
John, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. I'm going to take the prerogative of the organizer to ask and to convey some of the questions. The first one, I was extremely surprised, but I guess I was surprised by the statistics on the False Claim Act. It's dominated between 70 to 80% is dominated by healthcare. Do you have any explanation why specifically those false acts are dominated by healthcare and not equally distributed in other industries?
Yeah. A lot of that within the healthcare bucket, a lot of that is really made up of settlements with pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers. So over the years, you've seen the government settle with big manufacturers for paying kickbacks to speakers, or promoting off-label their products. So the settlements within the healthcare space, the majority of the dollars tend to relate to larger entities, and in particular pharmaceutical manufacturers and medical device manufacturers. But a good number of the settlements, not dollar amounts, do relate to healthcare professionals, hospitals, individual providers, and suppliers. But the dollar amounts are driven because the manufacturers have settled a number of these cases over the past 20 years.
So, in other words, the people that are committing those crimes could be equally distributed, but the amount that is embezzled, in a sense, quote unquote, is more prominent in the healthcare or more important in the healthcare, and in dollar amount they represent 70 to 80%. Correct?
Yeah.
The second question that I had is related to the OxyContin and Purdue Pharma settlement. Surprisingly, the family, the Sackler family, was coming even forward to provide even a bigger settlement that was negotiated with the intent to curb and to help the epidemic associated with the opioid. Could you comment on what happened exactly and how all the behind the curtain negotiation could be relevant to any case like that today?
Yeah, I don't have any inside baseball information about Purdue, but I mean, essentially the Sackler family, part of it may have been they didn't want to have individual liability or prosecution. So, given the focus on the opioid epidemic and given how big a player Purdue was in this, they probably felt like they had no other choice but to try to contribute those monies to combat the opioid epidemic.
It's remarkable that they came with a program to combat the opioid epidemic, and that's been remarkable. The money has not been redistributed in many places; is remaining around the area.
Yeah.
Another question that we have is how important is to periodically check the Sunshine Law site to see if information is up and correct.
I think that's up to the individual healthcare professional, right? I know that working on the manufacturer side, you have, certain subset of healthcare professionals who check it diligently. And, I know manufacturers keep very good records to support, what they reported to the government. But if you really feel like what was reported was inaccurate, then you should let the manufacturer know. And I will say there have been instances where on the compliance side, representing the manufacturers, we might hear a complaint from a healthcare professional to say, look, I did not get those meals, or I did not get that whatever transfer of value on those days because I wasn't even in the office that day. And not only is it a matter of the manufacturer at that point to correct their Sunshine Law reporting, but it also suggests some other improper behavior by a sales rep or somebody who noted that a doctor got a meal, because there are rules about when you can provide a meal and when you cannot, right? And so that has resulted in internal compliance investigations by these companies to say, why did this person record this person as having gotten that? And that's led to internal discipline and investigations by the company. So I think it's important because companies want to make sure that they're complying with the rules and that their employees are complying with the rules. And, you know, with off-label promotion or, you know, providing some improper value to an individual physician by some one person of the company or some representative of the company, there's only really two witnesses to that activity, right? It's the doctor and it's the company colleague. And so when you're thinking about it from a compliance perspective, representing manufacturers, you know, when a doctor says, hey, this rep promoted to me off label, or this rep recorded all these meals to me that I didn't get, I mean, that's actually to some extent useful information to the company, because now it gives them something that they can look at and say, hey, you violated our company policies internally, and impose the appropriate discipline on that person.
Another question is how many of the findings of fraud and abuse in medical billings are actually nefarious behavior as compared to just people not knowing how to process the claims, being so complicated and resulting just from ongoing mistakes and recurring mistakes.
Yeah, I think the settlements you've seen, by and large, at least the way the government's described it, it was intentional and deliberate, you know, upcoding and improper claims. I think what the government would say is we wouldn't go after you for innocent mistakes, you know, and I think innocent mistakes, if you were ever investigated and wanted to establish they were innocent mistakes, again, you would point to all those elements of a compliance program. You know, we train people on the right procedures, on the coding rules. We audited and monitored these things. And in fact, if you see the claims that we submitted in our auditing and monitoring results, you'll see claims that were both upcoded, overcoded, and maybe undercoded. So, you know, a lot of it is, if you're investigated, to be able to demonstrate to the government they were just innocent mistakes. It's those types of things that we show to them that they were innocent mistakes.
Thank you. Were the medical licenses of the physician found guilty of kickback or bribe affected at the end of the day? Meaning, at the end of the day, do they conclude with revocation of their physician license, and that would be a termination of the career, basically?
Yeah, I would assume that they got referred to the appropriate state medical boards who would have rescinded their licenses. But that would be a state medical board action, so it wasn't really, you know, sort of anything that the federal government did. But yeah, I would imagine that their licenses were revoked.
In a question that I have personally, as we deal with conflict of interest and compliance in academic institutions and in clinical trials, most importantly, those investigators that are successful in clinical trials, as you probably imagine, receive compensation for being in boards and for being working for other companies. And that creates a difficult process of monitoring and processing those conflict of interest. When and how would you consider that this is a flag and prevent a principal investigator really to participate and to lead a clinical trial for which he is probably the expert?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I think the first thing you have to do is obviously go through any conflict of interest clearing processes you have with your institution, right? Whether it's disclosing any of their, if I want to be a PI on a manufacturer's sponsored study, you know, making sure that I've disclosed any other financial arrangements I might have with that manufacturer to my institution, and have them make sure that they're comfortable with me proceeding to be a PI. I also think it's about, you know, if after the study is done, the product is approved, and now the company wants to reach out to you as a former PI to speak on behalf of the product or to provide other consulting, you know, you always want to make sure that, you know, those arrangements I'm entering into are for bona fide, real purposes, and not sort of to be, you know, basically getting a kickback to prescribe the product or to do anything improper. So it's really navigating the conflict rules, which I think is always the first step. And that usually that's going to be with your institution and making sure that you're disclosing everything to that institution about all the relationships you might have.
Are there still legitimate speaker bureaus for pharma companies?
There are, and the government, the OIG, again, the agencies responsible for overseeing the integrity of these programs, they came out with what's called a special fraud alert in November 2020, really expressing their skepticism over speaker programs and really asking the industry to tighten it up or even to reconsider after COVID whether these programs have to be live or in restaurants or whatever. And the industry, I mean, look, speaker programs are an important commercial activity that they engage in. They understand that the government's concerns because over the past 5 years, you've had, for example, Novartis entered into a $680 million settlement with the government last year, resolving in part allegations that they just had sham speaker programs. We're just paying speakers and attendees to come and get drunk at these dinners and paying the speakers just to prescribe the product and going to resorts and fishing trips and these boondoggles, and that they weren't real programs. And the government also pointed to the fact that Novartis never monitored these programs. They never looked at these programs. They didn't have any real compliance controls around these programs. And Novartis essentially settled these things for $600 and some million. As a result of that settlement and a number of other settlements regarding speaker programs, the government, they just don't like these programs, right? And I don't necessarily agree with the government. I do agree with the government that nobody agrees that we should have sham programs or just be whining and dining doctors to convince them to prescribe our products. But there is an important role that these programs play in communicating about the product. And quite frankly, like it or not, from a government perspective, they are promotional, right? It's not medical education. We're not putting on a CME event to provide medical education to a physician. It's a promotional event to talk about our product, share a voice, etc. It's like what I always say, government doesn't like the fact that a doctor goes to multiple programs over and over. And, my view is Coca-Cola, everybody knows it. They don't just run one TV ad, right? I mean, there is a commercial goal of these programs as well. But they still have these programs and they still have these bureaus, but companies are thinking about how to tighten up the controls given the OIG's concern.
An interesting development in the field is artificial intelligence and going through pattern in biomedical research of finding either a gene, a patient, an information. With this, is this going to increase the potential fraud and abuse in cases like the ones that you were describing? And how will we respond, or the feds are going to respond with the claim that the computer did the mistakes?
Yeah, and this is actually one of my colleagues focuses on this area more so than me. He's actually a medical doctor and also a lawyer in our Texas office. But yeah, I do think that this is an area that does have the potential also for fraud abuse, given like how the underlying algorithms work or the decision making works. So was it skewed improperly to recommend this service or that product or this course of action? So I think that the traditional concerns under the fraud abuse laws about corrupting decision making or steering patients or utilizing services apply just as equally with artificial intelligence.
Well, thank you so much, John, for this very insightful information and decision making. As you see, this is moving. The compliance issue is going to be a huge part of any academic institution, especially with hybrid component industry academic, where this has been a fertile ground for people abusing and using this fraud. And I appreciate very much you coming forward to enlighten us. I wish you all the best, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you very, very much.
All right, thank you.
Have a wonderful day, John.
All right, thanks, you too. Take care.
Bye-bye.